Thanks to everyone for joining. This is a fun experiment in trying to share some insights from history and bring them to the current day. It's very much a work in progress, so I hope you get a lot of value out of it, but if you have suggestions, please put them in the chat box or contact us through email or what have you. The impetus for this class really has two. Number one, I graduated with an economics degree and never once in college had to study Alexander Hamilton. I didn't really know who he was because I didn't take a lot of history classes. And the more time I spend in our industry, the more outrageous I think that is. And I don't think colleges are ever going to fix it. So I had the impetus this summer to make our interns, since we kept our internship program, take a history class with me. I was entirely unqualified to teach the 16-unit class. And I got a lot of help from a bunch of people, especially Scott Miller at Yale, but 4 PhDs helped co-teach or teach classes. But the most popular class this summer was that taught by David Cowen. And so I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about the foundational aspects and central banks and everything that happened at the beginning. David, take it away.
Thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure to be here. I see you are in full regalia and garb for the time period. I am joined by Maura Ferguson from the museum. She's our lead curator. She's going to help me with our slide deck so that it makes it a little easier. And if you're not familiar with the museum, I'm going to talk a fair bit at the end about it, but just a real succinct pieces that we preserve, exhibit, and teach about our nation's finances and financial history. We're also a Smithsonian affiliate, not a grand Smithsonian, but we are someone that can powerfully borrow from the Smithsonian institutions. And so we're going to kick it off here, but I'll just tell you, Preserve is our archives, and we've got some 13,000 record locators. Some have one object, some have 100, and we're going to show you some of those today. Exhibit, again, self-explanatory, and teach exactly what we're doing here. So again, a big shout out to VanEck for understanding the power and value of where we came from, this whole financial system. And so with that, we're going to jump into it. But before we get to Hamilton and the creation, we're going to take a step back and look at a little bit of what came before. And we're going to start with one of our older documents. And it's, I'll read it to you, and then we're going to ask you a question about it. And it's on vellum, which is this animal skin. This is an amazing document. And it says, this indenture made in the 3rd day of May in the year of our Lord 1682, and the 4th and 30th year of the reign of King Charles II. And you're going to see in this document that William Stanley, on the next slide, is going to get 5,000 acres in modern day Pennsylvania, signed at the bottom by none other than William Penn, of course. But what does he do in exchange for this document? We weren't going to open it up, or you can put it in the chat. For what does he have to do? So today you have $1 as the nominal exchange when you want to do something, right? From a seller to a buyer. Anyone have an idea in 1682 what the nominal exchange was? And we'll see if any of you can guess it. I'm going to give you one hint, particularly for those that are at VanEck.
Gold, cows, cotton.
All right. Not
crops, cattle.
Okay. Not gold, not cotton, not cattle, not something small. Go smaller, and it's not in the index.
Tobacco, whiskey. I like the whiskey. Chickens, peppercorns.
Go, stop. Tom Butcher. You got it, Tom. Peppercorns. Very good, Tom. Tiny, itty bitty peppercorns. So let's go back and look at the document with this filled in now, where it's going to say, more if you can so, yielding and paying. Therefore, and during the said term, unto the said William Penn and his heirs, the rent of 1 peppercorn only. That's a good deal. So now we're going to take it to the Revolutionary War, which is 1775 to 1783, to give you a little background on our finances. And I'm going to look at the financial aspect of things, not the battlefield aspect by and large. So the next slide shows you a piece of continental, the setup is how desperate things were at the time for the nation. You're looking at November 2, 1776. This is a letter to Captain Richard VanEck. You may know VanEck Street in New York. VanEck's going to be a mayor of New York, and he's literally the second in command by and large, even though he's a captain, because he's the aide-de-camp to Philip Schuyler, who's going to be Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law shortly. And so look at this desperate letter. November 2nd, Washington's lost the battle in New York, and so he's retreated to White Plains. He's lost a battle in White Plains, and now the army is starting to retreat pell-mell across New Jersey. And he says in this letter, I'll read it a little if we can bring it, that the major part of the soldiers have had no pay for 3 months and almost some of the officers for 6, and that it is impossible for the men to continue without clothes. Early in the letter, he talks how they're naked. And so it's a very difficult time right now for our nation. And the Continental Congress, which is the governing body, has to come up with an idea for how to fund these soldiers who literally have no guns or ammos. So what do they come up with? We call it Powerball 1776. That's right. That's their big idea. You can see it's now November 18th, 1776, 16 days later. So they issue this lottery. And how does this lottery do? It's not going to do too well for a couple reasons. One is we're up against the biggest superpower of the day and we're losing horribly. But then Congress, in their infinite wisdom, is going to have these lottery tickets pay off in bonds. They're not even going to pay off in cash. So do you want to take an investment right now in those bonds at this time period in American history? I don't think so. So let's keep going now and take a look at some more things. This was the currency I was referring to. These are called continental currency. And you can see that the date on this is May 10th, 1775. That's the date of the Second Continental Congress. So one of the first things the Continental Congress does is they start issuing currency. Sound familiar? And so this is like about a month after the fighting that started at Lexington and Concord. Let's look at some more things on this interesting note. You see this beautiful marbling. This is an anti-counterfeiting device, similar to today where we have anti-counterfeiting devices all over the bills that are in our pocket. This is attributed to Benjamin Franklin. He was very early on in creating some of these anti-counterfeiting possibilities. So the next thing are these incredible images that are going to be on all the notes I'm going to show you. The Latin, there's always a Latin phrase of encouragement. If you could go back more, that Latin phrase there is energy. You can see that the child is blowing a wind across the water. And so we don't have a US dollar at this point, so we can go to the next slide. So what are we going to tie these continentals to at the time? Well, they're going to get tied to Spanish mill dollars. Mill was a press, and they made grooves around the coins. So they're going to tie it to that or to gold or silver. And by the way, this is going to rapidly depreciate as the hyperinflation happens here. And I'm going to talk about that in a few moments because we really don't have gold or silver. And when you're losing battles, your money is going to depreciate. On the back side, you see a lot again of anti-counterfeiting. And then the Latin under this phrase I really like, but it's going to foreshadow all the difficult fighting that's coming. And it says, houses will cease to be quiet. So it's not just the Continental Congress, which is the governing body of the 13 colony states, but it's also going to be issued currency by individual colonies. So this is a particular Georgia note. Again, you see very elaborate with anti-counterfeiting. There's a rattlesnake on the bottom right. And then what are they going to back it with? Well, they don't have any gold or silver, so their idea is to back it from money arising from the sales of forfeited estates. Their big idea is, okay, we're going to grab loyalist lands. Remember, many people stayed loyal to the crown. And so their idea is we'll grab those and then we'll sell them. Well, what's the problem with that? You've got to win battles. And of course, you can see in the next slide, this was 1778, that note's issued. At the end of 1778, Savannah's captured. So these notes, not necessarily so good if you're going to be capturing forfeited estates when your whole main city has been captured. I'm going to show you one more. That's backside of this note, which says in Latin, no impunity. So this is a South Carolina note. And what's interesting about this is 8 Spanish mill dollars. This goes back to the Spanish pieces of 8, which were a regular currency in the colonies. But look at the backside of this. It says death to counterfeit. And the point here is that the British were counterfeiting our currency like mad. They're not trying to only beat us militarily, they're trying to defeat us economically by issuing a tremendous amount of our currency, hence the death to counterfeit. There's one other curious thing on the back of this, which I don't know why. There's 4 Hebrew letters. And I do know there was a Jewish community in Charleston at that time, but unclear to me why they would have this on the back of their notes. Okay, so I want to talk about hyperinflation because a lot of you, if you remember your economic history, they always talk about the famous German hyperinflation that takes place after World War I and really destroys that country economically. Well, guess what? That hyperinflation also happens here during the Revolutionary War. There's a great letter from George Washington. He's in Middletown, New Jersey, and he laments and writes that a wagonful worth of money will not buy a wagonful worth of provisions. And those Continentals are going to get retired eventually at 1 to 2 cents on the dollar. So it's not just Weimar, Germany, or Zimbabwe today, where you might hear things. It happened right here in the United States. It led to a phrase in history, not worth a continental, and moreover, an aversion, particularly during the first 75 years or so of our nation, whereby we did not have a currency that was issued by the government. Yes, that's going to change in what's called the greenback era during the Civil War, but a different story. But banks issued the currency all the way up into that time period. Okay, so let's take a look at how do you protect yourself at a time of hyperinflation. These are Massachusetts bonds. They were actually used to pay soldiers because they ran out of money to pay soldiers. And so here's Elijah Gardner. He's getting his pay, but look what they do. Not only would it yield 6%, but it's going to pay off in a basket of commodities. In this case, 5 bushels of corn, 68 pounds and 4/7 parts of a pound of beef, 10 pounds of sheep's wool, 16 pounds of sole leather. And this reminds me of a modern day tip. And so, quite frankly, you know, speculation, they say, is old as the hills. So is finance and financial ideas. So are there any bright spots during this Revolutionary War? Let's quickly go through one. Ben Franklin, as we know, is over in Paris trying to get money from King Louis XVI. And of course, you know, the French and English are traditional enemies at this time. And one of his successes is he gets a gift from France of 35 casks of silver to open a bank here in the United States. It's called the Bank of North America, the first bank ever in existence on our shores. And so this bank is going to open up in Philly, but Philly's blockaded by the British at the time. And New York is occupied by the British. So how are they going to get the silver over here? Well, it's a great story. Moore and others were involved in an exhibit at the museum several years ago on this, but it's landed in Boston. We actually had on display the bill of lading where John Hancock, who's governor of Massachusetts, signs for these 35 crates. They're going to make their way down to Philadelphia. It's going to be guarded, by the way, by local militia as well as the Marine Corps, which is in existence at that time. It lends to the government. They pay the soldiers for the first time at the head of the elk after 5 or 6 years, and then they go to the decisive battle at Yorktown. Now, I'm going to show you a document from that bank. Now, it says cashier of the bank. This is obviously a bank check. You guys know what this is. It says cashier of the bank because there's only one bank in existence. You don't have to say the name of the bank. There's some anti-counterfeiting on the left of this document. Again, we've seen that previously. We're in 90th dollars here. We're in Pennsylvania dollars. Each of these states had their own different currency, as well as the continental dollar. Very messy system of exchange. By the way, Hamilton's going to straighten that out in about 9-10 years. 2 July 1782, the reason this is highlighted, this is the earliest bank check in the public domain. I have seen one earlier. It's in tatters. It's actually at Wells Fargo because B&A eventually ends up in core states, which ends up in Wells Fargo, but you can't see that, and it's a bit of a wreck. So we're really excited to show this to you because this is an item that is 238 years old, and you know exactly what it is. Happens to be from one merchant, John Kidd, to another, Nash Richardson. Okay. In between the end of the war, which is 1783, And 1789, which is when Washington on April 30th is going to take the oath of office, each of these states are independent. And we've got a private's pay order, Michael Ely, private of the 1st Regiment in Pennsylvania, from that interperiod 1785. And take a look on the bottom right, who is the president of Pennsylvania? It's Ben Franklin. And so obviously this is a different world. By the way, this pay order is going to pay interest because they didn't have enough money to actually pay the soldiers, so they're paying interest on their certificates. But it's a different world where the president of your state is actually signing all of your pay orders than we live in today. So now we're going to take a look at a paradigm or a model that was created by Professor Richard Silla and several others. I mentioned Dick Silla because you're going to hear from him in a few sessions. And, you know, they start to study, and there's been a lot of thought over the years, why and how did certain countries rapidly develop? We're talking about the Dutch in the 1600s, the British in the 1750s, ourselves in the 1790s. The Germans and Japanese rapidly grew in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, and then the Asian tigers. And there's been a lot of theories over time. I know when I was younger and went to school, they said, oh, you know, the United States had great natural resources, or the United States had a great transportation system. But if you take a look and dial it back, and Dick came up with this model, think about it like a baseball field. And the first thing you need to get into place is a non-predatory government. And in our case, we'll talk about it in a moment a little further, is we got a US Constitution. And what do we mean by non-predatory? Well, in the main, it protects life, liberty, and property. And, you know, right now, it's all relative. Today, you know, we have a lot of people who might argue that their lives are not being protected. But again, we want to look at this as an overarching document, and we can definitely poke holes. There's a lot of flaws, and we'll get to some of those in a moment. Liberty, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Property, even democracies have eminent domain and can take things. But in the main, we're calling it a non-predatory government. And then what all those countries did was they unleashed their financial systems. What do I mean by that? A banking system, a central bank, commodity exchanges, stock exchanges. And then what happens next is financing occurs. Savers of capital meet users of capital. You get to second base and you unleash your entrepreneurs. And we know most entrepreneurs don't make it, but a few of the few of the few end up with the Googles, the Apples, and then they end up needing effective management. So before we talk about the United States case, I want to show you, and then we'll open it up because I want to show you one other example of a constitution that's very interesting. And I'm going to skip way down, but in this constitution, and I'm going to ask you, by the way, so pay attention, what country is this? Citizens have the right to work. And in Article 119, they've got the right also to rest and leisure, a working day of 7 hours, annual vacations with full pay. And then, of course, maintenance in old age, and our case of sickness or loss of capacity to work. And then, of course, you've got a right to education. You've got a right to higher education. Women, of course, equal rights in all spheres, and equality irrespective of their nationality or race. And like we did earlier, we want you to take a guess at what country this is. And let me open up. Where's my chat?
Sweden, Cuba, France, Denmark, Australia, not the US. Thanks. France. You guys are on the wrong track. You guys need to do the 16-unit summer course. Oh, we got one.
Yes, Keith Brodsky, very good. Next slide, Maura. Yeah, this is the 1938 Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin-led communist constitution. And so there's an obvious teaching moment here that's self-explanatory, but it's only words on a page. They certainly need to have enforcement. So let's take a look now at our constitutional convention, and really just a couple of highlights. You're well aware that the key that the founders wanted was checks and balances. And so we had a tripartite system, the executive, the judicial with the Supreme Court, and then the bicameral legislation. One of the things to focus on in this Constitution is Article 1, Section 8, and that's known as the sweeping clause, because it's going to play a big part in finance. And it says there that, the Congress can make all laws which are necessary and proper. And so when we start to talk about banking, I'll explain to you why that Article 1, Section 8 is so important. This obviously, and some of you have seen the show, Hamilton, you know about this. I went back to the states to be voted on. They were going to get started when 9 of them agreed, but there were some key states, of course, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And so in New York, there's something called the Federalist Papers. Hamilton pens 51 of the 85 newspaper articles explaining to New Yorkers, by and large, what this all meant. But to this day, the Federalist Papers are referred to quite often to understand, quote unquote, original intent, or what did these founders actually mean. And so now the system is set up. Go to the next slide, please, Maura. And we're going to talk about the financial, what we call a revolution in this country.
David, can I just interrupt for
Yes.
a second? Because I really want to pause. What I did with my students is I said, let's just have 3 big picture takeaways, 3 or 4 from every class. And I think that one of them relates to Hamilton's role in helping structure that home base or the Constitution. And there's, I think, 2 elements, again, oversimplified. Number 1, he was absolutely instrumental in getting the Constitution approved. Just the Federalist Papers and behind the scenes. And secondly, his philosophy around the Constitution was very different than those some other founders. He was fundamentally a realist, and he believed in the separation of powers. And so if you get frustrated by our government today, things moving slowly, the president and Congress of different parties, you can thank Hamilton for that, because he just thought that power corrupted absolutely. And he did not have a Jeffersonian Enlightenment view that people would tend towards the better. And so that's very much living with us today, that politicians are not perfect, to put a different phrase on it. But his contributions, which makes Hamilton a gigantic figure in history, and we're really talking about him today because of his role in finance, but his political, what he contributed on the political side is super important as well. And I just wanted to mention that we're targeting about an hour for the presentation with 15 minutes of questions and answers at the end. So I look forward to getting more input from all of you. But David, now this is one of the big money slides of the presentation. So pay attention.
All right, before I do that, I want to add something you said. It's in Federalist 15. Why does Hamilton say, do you even need government? And it's because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. So agreed with what you're saying there, Jan. Okay, so let's take a look at our country, 1788, before the Constitution is ratified, at our finances. And our national public finances are bankrupt. You have to understand that all these bonds that were issued, some 75 million domestic and foreign, and this is the state's debts as well as the national debt issued by the Continental Congress, is trading mostly at junk bond prices. Maybe Virginia, which wasn't that profligate, wasn't at junk bond, but most everything else was. Boy, Massachusetts has issued a tremendous amount. The Carolinas had, in other words, to finance the funding. But we're bankrupt. We're a junk credit. Nobody wants to touch us. The securities markets. Well, there might be a coffee house in a city or 2 where you might be able to get a price on your securities, but there's absolutely nothing organized whatsoever. There's no central regulating monetary authority like we think of in terms of the Federal Reserve. Corporations, there's only a handful, a manufacturing company, a hotel or so that was listed as a corporation, but nothing really en masse. Our money, well, we're relying on other nations' money. Foreign coins are circulating. Fiat money, nothing tied to gold or silver. And then the banks, there's all of 3. I mentioned the Bank of North America, which is in Philadelphia, the Massachusetts Bank, which is up in Boston, and then the Bank of New York, by the way, which is still around, BNY Mellon, here in New York City. So let's fast forward 7 short years. Well, our national public finances, we use the word, I believe, thriving on this. We have a US bond that's a 3% bond, a 6% bond, and something called a deferred bond where interest is going to start paying 6% in 1800. But a wonderful securities market that you can now trade very actively in Boston, in Charleston, in Baltimore, in New York, in Philly. And we know all this, by the way, because there's loads of price quotes in the newspapers of that day. And we know also the Buttonwood Agreement. We can talk about that a little bit at some stage, perhaps, but 1792. And we have a central bank, a central regulating monetary authority that's based in Philly that at this point has 5 branches and will eventually go up to 8 branches. And then corporations have exploded. We're well over 100. Recent scholarships is actually trying to point it towards 140. What about money? Well, we finally have the US dollar convertible to gold and silver at fixed prices. And we know, by the way, over history, that's going to play a big role in America. Whether, what should this rate be? Should it be convertible? We're going to leave that for future classes and Jan, if you tune in. And then banks. There's a great letter from a Secretary of Treasury that came in after Hamilton. They've mushroomed to 20. That was his phrase. They're growing like mushrooms. So we've got a whole banking system. And so I think you know the answer to this, obviously, but who either directly or indirectly instilled all of this? And it's Alexander Hamilton. He is the creator of the financial system. He was in office from Sep 11, 1789 to Jan 31, 1795. So how did he do this, right? This didn't just magically happen. He's going to write 3 monumental state papers that Congress needs to vote on to enact these. There's going to be a 4th monumental state paper on manufacturing, but I'm leaving it out of the equation for the moment. Report on a Mint. This is the one that's going to set the U.S. We're going to go back more. Not yet. This is going to set the U.S. dollar to gold and silver. It's going to peg it. Now, we don't have a lot of gold or silver, but it's going to set that into it. It's also going to set the dollar as the unit of account, the store of value, the medium of exchange, the quintessential definition of money. Now, I'm going to talk a little about the second report, and then we're going to go in depth on the first report. The second report is a report on a national bank. And this is where Hamilton is going to create a public-private enterprise. It's going to be owned 80% by the public, 20% private, but it is an anchor to an entire financial system. Let's think about some of the positives why before I get into some of the negatives. The positives, think about if Hamilton's got to pay a judge, let's say, in Charleston, South Carolina, where there's a branch. Well, if he doesn't have a branch, he's got to move gold, silver, or money to South Carolina. Now it's simply a book entry. What about open market operations? Now we can show the letter, Maura. This is a letter to the Bank of New York, September 4th, 1791. And he says here, I request you to furnish the cashier of your bank, that's the day-to-day manager, with a further sum of $50,000 to be applied towards purchases of the public debt. What's Hamilton doing here in terms of modern parlance? He's injecting reserves. We call these repos today when they do it. And yes, Hamilton did understand how a modern financial system would work, but it's not codified. So we often think about this in terms of Lombard Street and Bagot in the 1870s. Having said that, Hamilton, on the fly, created a tremendous amount of central banking principles. Now, if we just want to back up to the bank for a sec, back to that other slide, this bank was highly controversial. And to get this through Congress was very difficult because by this time, Jefferson and the Virginians are looking to block a lot of what Hamilton's doing. And they actually, after it gets passed through Congress, it goes up to Washington, George Washington's president, to be signed. And he's not sure what to do. So he asks 2 cabinet officers, Jefferson and Edmund Randolph, who is the attorney general, what should they do about this? And they both say, kill the bank. We don't need a bank like this. And then Hamilton, going back to that Article 1, Section 8, creates the living, breathing Constitution. He says, no, the Constitution it's elastic. It can do things like open a national bank, open a corporation. And so this is another flashpoint between Hamilton and his enemies that we're going to get into. But let's take a look at what we call now the Report on Public Credit. This is the economic equivalent of the US Constitution. And so as we mentioned, the debt of the United States, it's not really the United States at this time, it hasn't been assumed, but is trading at junk bond prices. And so what to do about that debt? Do you honor that debt or do you forget about that debt? And so Hamilton, let's go to the next slide. And by the way, these are all originals. Let's take a look at history. Well, in China, when the communists come to power, they take a look at Shanghai Shek's debt and they repudiate it. By the way, the museum has a lot of bonds from China, so if they ever do honor that debt, it would be a good funding mechanism for us. The Russians, the communists, when they come to power, they renege on the Tsar's debt. But Hamilton turns this on its head and says, you know what? We should honor our debts. We should assume all of this. Well, this is a hot potato, right? I had mentioned earlier the Virginians weren't that profligate, but certainly Massachusetts were. They weren't thinking like a country. Why in the world, the Virginians are saying, are we paying for Massachusetts, the Carolinas, Georgia? That doesn't make any sense to them. So this is blocked in Congress. And so let's go to the next slide of how this debt first is so powerful. Hamilton realizes, and this is his quote, a national debt. Now, I want to say this next phrase because a lot of enemies of Hamilton take this out. If it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be a powerful cement of the Union. And I will just say, by the way, Jan, when we first taught this class, the national debt was around 23 trillion. Now we're some 4 or 5 months later when I'm teaching with you, it's up to 27 trillion. And so I think Hamilton and a lot of other founders would be, boy, is this excessive. But a lot of people omit that phrase from this to try and be a detractor of Hamilton because there is a direct line from this national debt to that $27 trillion, which I told you today. Hamilton, it is true, he creates this national debt. But why is this powerful? And it has a lot to do with our credit. It gets America a good credit. And why is that amazing? So let's take a look at the next slide. So within a few years, this is 1803, our credit's so good that we can go borrow $11.25 million of the $15 million we need to purchase Louisiana Purchase through Napoleon. So this is actually a 6% stock, that's nomenclature. These are bonds that are issued, if you take a look, by Hope and Company of Amsterdam and Francis Baring and Company of London. This is, yes, the fabled Baring brothers that went under 25 years ago. But the point here is this. We were able to float $11.25 million. It was the largest deals up to that time. And we did it through investment bankers that were overseas. And think of the irony, by the way, we'd gone to Napoleon to buy New Orleans. He said, I'll throw in everything. The $3.75 million difference, by the way, was that France had been mauling our shipping. So we're going to write that off. But Napoleon is going to get the money. We're going to get it from the British. So we take the money from the British and the Dutch underwriting this, who are going to give us the money. We give it to Napoleon. What does he do with it? He's going to build an army and attack the British and everybody else. So the old adage, business is war, war. But the point is we had gotten a great credit, and that's due to Hamilton. So going back to what's in this report. So Hamilton can't hold his ink. We all know that. This report is 16,000 something words long. I'm going to try and boil it down to 6 words for you, which is buried in a paragraph that says, the reflection derives additional strength from the nature of the debt of the United States. It was the price of liberty. And I love those 6 words. He's saying it's a moral obligation. Well, that still didn't convince the Virginians. And so how is he going to do this? Well, there's a famous dinner party that takes place on Maiden Lane. It is between 2 influential Virginians. Both will be future presidents, Jefferson, Secretary of State, Madison, very influential member of Congress, and Hamilton. And this is the famous trade. I call it the most famous trade in American history, whereby Hamilton swaps the capital, not to be in New York, not to be in Philly, and everybody was vying for the capital, but to be on the shores of the Potomac to be built 10 years hence. And this is the deal that the Virginians agreed to, but also feel hoodwinked by Hamilton. Hamilton was smart. He knew that would tie the Virginians into the country if he gave them the capital. He wasn't as interested as he was in the entire financial system. Now, the next slide, this is a wrap. I think you guys know that this is Lin-Manuel Miranda, the show Hamilton. This was my office. Lin came to the museum multiple times to conduct research. So did Leslie Odom Jr. come. I did happen to have a picture, I always did, of Hamilton hanging behind me. That's the Hamilton bobblehead on the bottom left. We're hamming it up there for the pistols, which they're not real. These are replicas. The real ones, I've seen them, they're up at JP Morgan in their archives. In any event, it was really fun to interact with Lin. He's a terrific guy. I was fortunate to be there opening night and have gone several other times. If we have time at the end, I can tell you some anecdotes, but I'll just tell you one quick, other anecdotes, I'll tell you one quick one. He and Leslie were there. I was showing him the report on public credit, the original that I was with you. He turned to Leslie. Again, remember, the show hasn't come out. Nobody knows what's happening. And he says to Leslie, the room where it happened. And I really didn't put two and two together other than to say to Lin, yeah, you want to see where that is? There's a plaque, you know, where that is. And they both looked at me. And then we went, I showed them where Jefferson's residence was, and they filmed there. And then I didn't put two and two together until I was sitting watching the show, and all of a sudden the room where it happened, and I put it all together, which is kind of funny. But in any event, we can talk more about the show if you'd like in the Q&A section, but let's keep moving along here. Okay, we don't really have the money, right? Hamilton's gonna get this through Congress. But what do we do? So what everyone does is turns in their debt. This is one of the prized possessions of our museum. This is George Washington's debt. He turned in his Virginia debt that he had in our country, and he would be reissued 3 securities, a 3% bond, a 6% bond, and that deferred one that started paying interest in 1800. Why? It's called a haircut in modern parlance. But the point is that we, Hamilton, didn't have the money to pay everything off. He had to give you a haircut and push it off, but we did honor our debts. So if you go back one sense, because a lot of people do ask, there was a large ledger, go back one sec, please, on the left-hand side, and it equates to the amount. So this was $185.98. There's a 1, an 8, and a 5 been clipped, and you got to that same thing so that you couldn't cheat or do it. The hole punch means that it was a retired bond. So how did this go over? Well, it really jettisoned and jet-started our country. By the way, the bank, to help fund the bank, you would have to turn in some of these bonds, so that helped underpin the stock market for those bonds for the bank. But not everybody was in love with this. So have a look at Patrick Henry's bonds. Now, Patrick Henry is familiar for the phrase, you know, give me liberty or give me death. And he was a hothead. But guess what? He had bought Virginia bonds, but he thought the United States might be turning back into England, and he wasn't happy at all. And therefore, I always call him one of America's first day traders, because he took his US bonds, and we don't have the backside, but he sold them a day later. So not everyone was enthused at this time. And by and large, there's going to be massive attacks, but I want you to understand partisan politics, left, right, and center at this time. The Virginians are going to attack Hamilton openly, and they're going to bring him up on charges called the Giles Resolution in Congress. And I'm really excited to show you the next document, because we, Dixel and I, we just bought this for the museum just a couple weeks ago. And so it's the first time we're showing it. And it's a letter from John Trumbull. He is Nancy Pelosi. He's Speaker of the House. And he's writing about these very charges that Hamilton's being brought up on to George Washington, the president. And he says basically, Your Excellency must thus doubtful have seen in some newspapers the resolutions introduced to the House of Representatives by Mr. Giles of Virginia. And then I'm going to skip along that tending to the alarms and fears and apprehensions of the public respecting the fiscal administrations. And then he says the enclosed, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, is sufficient to show the fallacy and futility, basically, of what is being propagated, and the motives, which he underlines at the end, of which the accusations have been grounded, not the most honorable to the propagators. So back then, just like today, it is very messy. And what he's saying here effectively is two things. One is, to use the modern parlance, it's fake news what they're saying about Hamilton. But he refers to two documents in here. And the thing that he enclosed is 30 pages that Hamilton produced to Congress showing where the expenses were and revenues. But then he expands upon that in a 90-page document called the Revenues and Expenditures of the United States for the year 1792, of which we have an original copy. And we're going to show you some of the things in there because it is fascinating. So we'll take a look at it next. Maura, I think it's up next. There it is. So this is in a display case. I'm going to zero in on a couple pieces of this. So let's take a look at the revenue side first. So how's Hamilton going to pay for everything? Well, he's going to have a revenue on tariffs. Now, I call this spreadsheet, this is amazing. It's 2 feet long. It comes out like an accordion. It's amazing. I call it Excel 0.1. Now, all of the ports reported to Hamilton. And what we're doing is there's a tariff, which is nothing more than a tax on imported goods at these various ports. Now, Hamilton didn't want a very high tax. He knew that would choke off all these imports, and he didn't want it too low because he needs to raise money, and therefore you needed it just right, which he did set. Now, there's also going to be a tax on other things. If you go to the next slide, oh, this just shows you, I always thought this was interesting. He doesn't list the ports alphabetically by state. He did it north to south, which I thought was always interesting. And then what was the total amount he raised in 1792? He raised $4,615,559, 36 and 1.5, or 36.5. So I thought that was interesting. So that's the total amount of revenue at the time, but from the ports. But there's other revenue, and this is a particularly fun one to look at. This is the next. There's 3 of these spreadsheets, by the way. This is the duties arising from spirits distilled and country stills. This is the whiskey tax, guys, that was so controversial. It's the outline of the state of Pennsylvania because they couldn't collect a penny from Pennsylvania. This is where the farmers in Western Pennsylvania refused to pay, chased the tax collectors out, led to what's called the Whiskey Rebellion. This is a massive challenge to the US government. And Washington actually leads the troops as far as Bedford, Pennsylvania, a massive show of force, 12,000 troops. Hamilton, never wanting to miss a fight, leaves the Treasury Department in control, the number 2 guy, and heads out with the troops to Western Pennsylvania. It is suppressed without a shot. The leaders are arrested. To Washington's credit, he exonerates them. He doesn't. They were going to be hung, but he says, no, we're not going to do that. And that's a good thing. So it is put down with a massive show of force. So going back to this document, let's take a look at the expense side. Well, the first one is of course, is Washington's salary. And he gets $25,000. There's some timing differences here where it's only $22,500. And then let's take a look at the vice president, because, you know, John Adams and Alexander Hamilton did not get along. And Adams is going to get $5,340. His salary is $5,000. There's a warrant he gets paid. But Adams wasn't the biggest fan of the vice presidency, but just hold on to that $5,000 because it's going to come back in a moment. And on the next slide, you can see what he said, that it's such a great quote, that my country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. Okay. Well, let's take a look at what Hamilton's being paid. Hamilton, his assistant, a couple of clerks and messengers, is over $10,000, twice what the vice president is getting. And I've often wondered, we know Adams and Hamilton clashed, but maybe he was a little resentful that Hamilton got paid a lot more than him. Let's take a look at Jefferson. What is he getting paid? He's getting less. He's only getting $8,000 for his clerks, messengers, and salary. And then what I love, Foggy Bottom is renting their office. Can you imagine? Back then, they don't even have a permanent office. How about the Pentagon budget? Well, we take a look at that under Henry Knox, 9,000, a little bit over 9,000. Now, to be fair, this budget is going to go into the millions, and in the next few pages is the Army in the field, which does go into the millions. But the teaching moment, or the difference now, is everything is centralized at the top at the Pentagon and then dispersed out. Back then, everything was inverse. It went in a different direction. And then in this document, there's pensions. I'm going to spend just 2 minutes quickly going through something because it's something that our curator found that's fascinating in this 90 pages. We know some of these well-known names. Von Steuben was a general, came over from Prussia. He's getting a pension from Congress. But there's these three militiamen, Paulding, Williams, and Van Wert. What in the world is Congress paying them for? And if you go down, this goes back to the famous treacherous story of Benedict Arnold, whose liaison is Major John Andre, when he's going to give up the fort at West Point. Andre's coming back through the U.S. lines. These three militiamen capture him. Andre tries to bribe his way out with everything that he has, including pistols, gold, whatnot, but he's got the plans of West Point on him. The militiamen do not let him go, do not take the bribe, turn him in. Of course, Arnold is then uncovered, and it leads to Andre being hung and Congress giving them a pension for life. This happens to be a whole memorial where that particular incident took place. They were also given a Fidelity Medal, one of the first medals ever issued by Congress. This one was to John Paulding, but it's just an amazing, and as I like to say, this document, there is a PhD waiting to happen out of the revenues and expenditures. So what's the bottom line? Could Alexander Hamilton balance a budget? And the answer is yes. 9,746,364.51 to the penny, debits equal credits. But interestingly, what was debt service at that time? And it's a whopping like 23% back buried in these pages of he's got to pay off that debt. So it wasn't easy for Hamilton, but he absolutely made it happen. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes now. That's the end of the formal remarks for Q&A, but I just want to tell you a little bit about the museum because I've got this opportunity and I sincerely appreciate it. First, if you want to take a deeper dive, we really gave you the 60,000-foot view. Professor Sill and I have written a book that the third author really is Hamilton, where we break down some 20 of his writings to really take a deeper dive into his logic, what he was thinking. Secondly, the museum has a magazine called Financial History. It is free. It is a quarterly range of topics. So just go to fhmagazine.org. You can sign up for that. Again, free. Next, a little bit about the museum. Our exhibit area is currently closed. Having said that, I want to show you some of the exhibits that we did. We did a beautiful gold exhibit. Those are the middle two, including borrowing a lot of items from the Smithsonian. That gold album in the bottom center is actually Sounds of the Earth, which they made three. One is on Voyager 1, one is on Voyager 2. The third one was given to the Smithsonian. This is in case an alien ever found that spacecraft. We had it, a great gold exhibit. On the upper right, we had a Black Sun currency exhibit. Lower right, we had many Alexander Hamilton exhibits. That statue that's showing there is in the museum's collection of Hamilton. It's the model for the statue in Central Park. And at that moment, we brought at that exhibit the Scottish Hamilton descendants to meet the American Hamilton descendants for the very first time. Upper left is a beautiful currency exhibit. Lower left is a Woman on Wall Street exhibit. Moving on, we have traveling exhibits. On the left-hand side are two where we're currently at PayPal's headquarters with a fully digital experience. Top middle, we were at the Schwab Financial Impact Conference, bringing out some of our gems. On the far right and below, we're at Citadel's headquarters in Chicago with an exhibit. So for the right price, see me, and we can talk about having an exhibit at one of your firms. Bottom middle is an exhibit we currently have at the Municipal Archives, shut obviously because of the quarantine. Quickly moving on, this is our gala. It's our main fundraiser. It's in February. You can see some of the luminaries. Last year, our honorees were Dan Schulman, upper left, and James Gorman in the middle. That's Professor Sill on the left, who you're going to hear from, and Bill Dudley, and you know some of these other honorees and their faces. And then we have a very robust lecture series. This is just an example of some recent individuals. Those are the Winklevi, Howard Marks, Carol Loomis, who wrote for Fortune for 50 years. You know, of course, the former Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers. We've had a dozen events. They're all on Zoom. We do these with Fordham and the CFA. We're getting hundreds of people attending these. These are the most recent ones. You can see we had Tim Geithner, Bob Schiller, some big names. And coming up in the next month, we've got 5 or so that you can sign up for. All you have to do is go to moif.org/events. These, again, are free. We want you to be, we want you to sign up and come. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the collection. I mentioned earlier, it's some 13,000 record locators. It is our nation's financial heritage. We are not fully digitized. We are hardly digitized. And therefore, we're out on a whole national financial heritage program to digitize these. We want future generations to see them. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We give you an opportunity, if you so desire, to give MOF to text at that. You can also follow us. You want to keep that up for a sec, on a variety of different platforms. At Finance Museum is our Twitter handle. Love to see all of you just become more engaged with the museum. It's our industry's museum. We should be proud of it. I often say that finance is the horse to the economy's cart. And with that, I want to thank Jan again. And Jan and I will open up to questions, and maybe Jan, you'll help me answer some of them.
Well, I want to touch on a couple of points if I could, and then we'll open it up. So my first question is, and maybe you all can answer in chat, who is the biggest rival intellectually or thought-wise to Hamilton? Because part of what I think about, okay, we're getting that one right. So part of what I think about is we are in the finance industry, and we play a role. And of course, we all love Hamilton, okay, but there was a major critique of Hamilton. And so let's talk about that for a little bit, David. So what did Jefferson, what did he think of us today? I want to connect it to today. What would he thought of us?
He was not a big fan of the Wall Street, or what we want to call the money issues, banks. There's some great letters. There's a lot of scandals that are going to happen during this time period. So Hamilton's number 2 at Treasury, William Dewar, he's going to leave and become a securities speculator in 1791 and 1792. And he's going to try and corner the market. And the market is going to go racing up, and it's going to collapse. It's going to do this 2 different times, once in 91 and 92. And Jefferson and Madison are furious over this. And there's lots of letters back and forth. Like, these stock jobbers, they don't create anything. What are they doing? That was the big phrase. And then later on with banking, so Jefferson becomes president, he turns to Albert Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury, and he says, destroy that Bank of the United States. I couldn't stand it back then. And then Gallatin really looks at it, I'll let you go, and says, and by the way, he also says it's like the Praetorian Guard. It's going to, crush the government. You got to take out the banks. And Gallatin basically says no. And he's got several letters. I absolutely need this bank to run the government. And these bankers, quote unquote, if they get out of line, I can, quote unquote, crush them. So,
and so what did the Virginians speculate in? Oh, that's probably the wrong word, but what did they invest? No, I'm not asking you. I want the crowd. What did the Virginians put their money? What did they think? What asset did they think was virtuous? Okay, land. And Jefferson believed, in contrary to all you people that just play with money all day, that a virtuous life was a self-sufficient life. And think of a farmer, right? Basically, and 95% of America, and this is, my kind of take on this history is, studying history from a business perspective gives us real insights into their philosophies. So Jefferson was I would call it a farmer philosophy, because he thought, well, I should, and of course we know it's not true because he had slaves and things like that, but people should be self-sufficient. And we're going to draw a very sharp philosophical, political contrast already in the next class, when we're going to talk about the first factories and working for the man, working for someone else, and losing one's freedom. So Jefferson intellectually was kind of like a Marxist in that sense. that he thought people should, kind of have independence from the capitalists, from the money people like us. So he didn't like that. And what also did he not like about what Hamilton was doing from a moral perspective, and David talked about it as well, is politically too much power in that damn central bank. I mean, today, sitting here, thank God for the central bank, because they bailed our industry out in April by coming in and intervening, which is exactly what Hamilton did, and we'll talk about that in a second. But, central banks have too much power. So, my cocktail party takeaway is, when was the central bank started in the United States, or how many central banks has the United States had? Let's just leave that for a second. How many central banks the United States have? Not many good guesses. So not many reserves. I'm saying in history at different times, how many central banks did we have? 182. Come on now. All right, Keith, you got it right again. 3.
So can I just make a point about those? So the first one is the one we talked about, 1791 to 1811, a 20-year charter. And the Jeffersonians are in power, so they're going to kill this bank. But guess what? 5 years later, in 1816, the same Jeffersonians are going to recharter the second bank of the United States, and they're going to clone it bigger and badder, because it was 10 million in capital, the first one. They make it 35 million. So all of a sudden, maybe central banks are good if you're the one in power. Now, why did they do this? Well, guess what? We had the War of 1812 in the interim, and it was a terrible time for Albert Gallatin to try and finance that, because he had no central regulating monetary authority to help him do so. It was all fractured after 1811. So these same folks said, you know what, it's better for us. But by 1836, Andrew Jackson's in power, and he was no friend of banks. He wanted the money to go to his quote unquote pet banks. So it's killed, and there is not another central regulating monetary authority until the Federal Reserve, as you mentioned. Jan, there's also one sleeper in there, though. Congress does charter the Freedmen's Bank after the Civil War to try and help all the freed slaves. So it's actually a fourth sleeper charter in there. Having said that, that one all collapses not because of the slaves, but because the people that ran it, who were white individuals, actually were scandalous with the funds.
All right, so the official answer is 3.
Officials 3.
So you go home, we've had 3 central banks in our history. And it's kind of sad that we had. So what happened in the meantime? Who issued currencies?
Do you want to take that, or?
Yeah.
Great. So the banking system actually issued currencies. And this isn't the greatest system let's take which period it is. So between this period and the Civil War, it's called wildcat banking. So the banks are issuing the paper currency. But the issue is fractional reserves, right? How much gold or silver do they have in the vault? And a lot of unscrupulous banks would constantly overissue. It's also a terrible system for an economy because the further away you get from the bank, the paper would depreciate because you can't get back to the bank to present it. And so it's just a terrible system of commerce that was fraught with error. And there's all these merchants who have to take these books to try and figure out, is this currency any good? Except when they had the Bank of the United States, by the way, those notes were good as gold. And you could present them at the ports collectors for the tariffs. By the way, counterfeiting of these banknotes, rampant. I've read a lot of newspaper articles, very serious crimes, people being branded on their foreheads with the letter C for counterfeiting, all sorts of ingenious, Hamilton writes about it, gangs and thieves that are creating these counterfeit notes.
So one last topic, and then we really will open it up for questions and have a show and tell, right? So Hamilton helps create the Constitution. He basically puts in the structure for our financial markets. So I'm gonna need David to help me talk about that a little bit, but I want you all to put on your speculators hats, because you're all in finance and you don't care what Jefferson has to say. And we're going to look at a chart, hopefully I get this right, of the stock of the Bank of the United States. So of course you can't own shares of the Federal Reserve. It wasn't set up that way. Or, I'm sure David can correct me, but basically I can't buy shares in the Federal Reserve. But you could of the first bank of the United States. And so the bank was capitalized at $10 million. So this was like a whole separate deal, right? So the continental debt was assumed by the federal government and they issued government bonds. Boom, new asset class. Here you've got a central bank and he's going to start raising money, and anyone could invest in the central bank. And frankly, a lot of the money came from overseas. And you had to put in $400 or promise to, but your first piece was something called the Bank of New York script. And I'm going to ask you all what you would pay for that script. So we know the book value of the bank would be, let's call it $10 million or $400 a share. So it would be $25 script initially, which is the bottom of this red line, plus the $375 you have to pay later. So why would you pay, and I'll open it up, why would you pay more than $25 for the stock of a central bank? I need a speculator. No speculators?
I'll read some. Expecting future appreciation. That's like a try to resell, inflation, coupons, full faith and credit, zero default.
Well, why do you, all right, should I pick someone? All right, I'm gonna pick one of my colleagues. Brandon, can you join me?
Hey,
Hey, all right, you and I are, we're running a hedge fund. And how much should we pay for this central bank stock? Why would we pay more than book value? Why would anyone pay more than book value for a share of Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan?
you're paying for future earnings potential, I would assume.
Profits?
Yeah.
So are you a buyer of this?
Looks like it based on that chart, yeah.
Well, you don't know the chart, so let's say it's up here. Of course, reason number one to buy anything, it's going up, right? We already covered that. But why do you think it's going to be profitable?
That's a good question.
I'll tell you why I think it's going to be profitable. Dude, it's a quasi-monopoly. It's a monopoly. There are not that many banks around. Business will be booming. They have to come to us, right? And Hamilton's involved, so that means it's probably good too, right? He's kind of a, he's got the golden touch. So anyway, so the price of this script went up from $25 initially, I guess, over to over $375. I mean, it looks like a growth stock today. It's like Zoom, right? Looks like ISPO. So anyway, the blue line here, and so anyway, so that's what people were speculating. The blue line is on the right. I don't know if you can see this 100%, but it's the percentage of par value of the government debt at the time. So what this basically shows is that when the first assumption was done, people were, valuing it sort of 86 cents on the dollar. That's kind of like the price of fallen angels these days, right? And then it went up past par, which basically implies that interest rates were falling during this time period. So credit got really good and interest rates kept falling. And then there was a little bit of a financial crisis, and now I'm going to turn it over to David. What happened during our financial crisis in March and April and in 08, 09? Well, stocks went down, but actually government bonds went up as a safe haven. But back then, the price of government debt and the stock of the central bank both went down, sort of like more of an emerging markets kind of situation, which is we've got a crisis. and there's a liquidation on all assets. So different kind of behavior. So David, why don't you kind of just add a little bit, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Sure, just seeing this chart.
Well, tell us what Hamilton did.
I'll do that, but first let me do, I should have helped Brandon a little, because the Bank of the United States, if there was an S&P at the time, it would have been 50% of the S&P. It was that big a monopoly that Jan referred to, and I could have helped you a little if I had given you that little hint, right? That might have made it a little easier for you. There's a lot to be, one of the things, by the way, that jumps out when I see this, and I just recently just saw this, John showed it to me just a few minutes ago. Just so you're aware, arbitrage was going on too. This is, it says Philadelphia. There were markets in New York. There were markets in Boston. And so clever people, once the market started falling, and we've got great letters of the day, particularly in New Jersey, where they're saying stagecoaches are rushing through town, what's going on, to get to New York to try and sell before others realized what was happening. So arbitrage, obviously, also as old as the hills. So again, just to make sure people understand this, this is the 1791 dress rehearsal for the major 1792 panic that's going to take months and months to get out of. This was a short blip where Hamilton knew what to do. Part of the problem was there was only 5 securities at the time. The 3 government bonds I mentioned to you, the stock of the Bank of the United States, and the shares of the Bank of New York. That's it. So it was a rush for liquidity, because what had happened was, and particularly in 92, the bank opens. It's going to flood the market with loans. A lot of the loans were what was called accommodation paper, because people saw what had happened, saw the markets going up. It's going to repeat itself much more dramatically in 92. And so they borrow from the bank on short term to buy securities, which pushes it even higher. Hamilton writes a letter in February 92, which says the superstructure of credit is too vast. It should be abridged or brought down gradually. The problem is the bank hits the brakes and sucks money out, calls in these loans, and the whole market collapses. It is a problem of liquidity. Hamilton, in his genius, comes up with a lot of ideas, but comes up with the idea also, not just of putting money in, which he does through the sinking fund, which we didn't even talk about, which was a mechanism to retire the debt, and he was building up capital in that. So he used some of that. He needed there were 5 people. He needed 3 votes. Jefferson voted against it. He was one of the voters, but Hamilton luckily got that 4-1. John Jay was also on that. But in any event, they push money back into the system. But he also says to the Bank of New York in a very famous letter that you should lend at a usurious rate, which was all of 7 or 8% of penalty rate, but you should lend freely at this time. It is not a time to contract. I saw one question which I wanted to answer, Jan. Can we go over to that in the Q&A?
Yes, please.
Which Thomas asked, Hartfield, was there friction between central banks and private banks? Great question. And the answer is yes. First of all, each of these towns started to have a lot of banks, but the branches in these particular cities started to, when they felt these other banks were over issuing, and I've studied the balance sheets of the first bank, for instance, it would call in their paper and make them produce gold or silver, which really upset them. It's also competing with them, right? This giant bank that's doing that. So terrific question that yes, there was, and we learn all that, by studying the actual balance sheets, which are fascinating and tease out so much of that story. And possibly another reason in 1811, because when the bank is killed then, or in 1836, guess who gets the government deposits, which are the plum? The local banks do. So in many ways, they're not a fan of this monster bank. But also, lastly, there were politics involved. And in many ways, these banks were banks of one part or the other. In New York, initially, there is the Bank of New York and the branch of Hamilton's bank. Hamilton wrote the charter for the Bank of New York. Both of these institutions are run by Federalists. It's one of the reasons Aaron Burr is so angry, and he creates the Manhattan Bank. Now, how he does this, he hoodwinks Hamilton. This is one of the major friction points between the two of them, goes back to finance, because he says Manhattan needs fresh water. And so Burr gets others like Hamilton to agree up in Albany that Manhattan, which does need fresh water, opens the Manhattan Water Company, but simultaneously buries in a codicil that this water company can take deposits, make loans or whatever. And then he opens the Manhattan Bank. So he's hoodwinked to Hamilton. And it's, by the way, why Manhattan Bank, which becomes Chase Manhattan, which becomes JPM, their symbol to this day is a water pipe. Chase's symbol is a water pipe. And in that exhibit that we have right now at the Municipal Archives, which you can't get to, that Moore created, we have one of the original water pipes.
Okay.
Let's see, are there any? Can you recommend a? Well, Jan, you've been doing a lot of this. Keith wants to know about recommending a good book overviewing financial history. You've got a whole reading list. Do you want to share any of that?
The real difficulty, what I did this summer was try to give the students less than an hour worth of homework. And part of the reason we're doing this is there's just not a lot of good stuff that's shorter out there. There's hundreds, there's thousands of books just on the FDR bank crisis. I'll post some of my favorites. I think Lowenstein's book on the founding of the Fed was pretty interesting to me because just what David was talking about, the banking system was so backwards. And this is like, what, 100 years ago? It's kind of unbelievable, but that was interesting. But there's a tons of resources, but I'll be blogging some of that stuff and sharing it. Thanks for your interest.
So Jan, this was a very quick 1 hour and 15 minutes. I'd love to hear some feedback too, whether people liked how this went or didn't, what we could change for the future, right? This is our inaugural moment with it. And so, but if you do want to wrap up.
Well, I'm happy to wrap up. I'll give you my wrap up. So what I would do with all the classes, I'd say there's 3 cocktail party takeaways. And then at the next class, I'd ask them and they wouldn't remember. I was like, well, that was really frustrating. So number 1, Hamilton was a realist, which is why he believed in the separation of powers. And I think philosophically, there were a lot of fights that went on, but I think that's the fact that he helped get the Constitution passed is obviously an important aspect, but it just philosophically, that was important. Number 2, the debt deal, the assumption of continental debt, the restructuring, if you will, one of the best and most important restructurings in history, and rolling that out effectively into our first treasury bonds. So that's number 2.
Can I jump in on 2? Because I forgot to, I think I call it the greatest bailout, in American history. We've had lots of bailouts, but that's what we did. We bailed out the states. We bailed out the former government.
It was a political judgment, right? It was a moral judgment. So, but I think tying that to where DC is now, right? So that whole deal of the reason we did that is so Washington DC went to the Virginians who cared more about that than they cared about the assumption of the debt, which is kind of interesting. So that deal is huge. So first government bonds, and then the first central bank. And I think what we just learned about the central bank was interesting that we've had 3, but Hamilton started the first one. And that really helped propel the growth of our capital markets set the stage of transitioning from a real farmer economy, an economy that was really just structured to provide natural resources to England